Welcome everyone to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight is Comprehensivist Wednesdays, and we'll be covering this evening tools for comprehensivity, ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox with my good friend CJ from the Philadelphia Thinking Society. CJ, take it away.
Hi, welcome to Comprehensivist. Let me get some light here. Welcome to Comprehensivist Wednesdays, an ongoing series of weekly events designed to foster the art of comprehensivity, our learning practices for building an ever more extensive, ever more intensive, and ever more integrated understanding of our worlds and its peoples. Buckminster Fuller called it being adequately macro-comprehensive and micro-incisive. Tonight's topic, as Joe mentioned, is tools for comprehensivity, ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox. Comprehensive learning aspires to integrate more and more of humanity's traditions of learning to better comprehend the world and how it works. As we learn more and more from these diverse ways of knowing, it becomes increasingly likely that the perspectives, hypotheses, and frames of reference that we encounter will seem incompatible or even inconsistent with others. Tonight, we will explore how to better accommodate these ambiguities as tools for our comprehensive practice. This way of accommodating ambiguity in our learning is a central theme in the profound 2007 book, How Mathematicians Think Using Ambiguity, Contradiction, and Paradox to Create Mathematics by William Byers. The book examines ambiguity while it surveys the folklore of mathematics culture and the philosophy of mathematics. It's an easy-to-read book and serves as a good introduction to mathematics for readers with weak math skills. It might be especially valuable if any of you want to expand the compass of your comprehensive learning with mathematics. Tonight we have 3 segments with interactive sessions after each. If any of you are new, that means you will be asked during the interactive sessions to contribute questions or thoughts about our topic. This is an interactive forum. Let's get started. The first segment, I'm going to survey this notion of ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox. In the book, How Mathematicians Think, William Byers argues that the power of mathematical ideas comes from their ambiguity. Let's start with his definition of ambiguity. The quote, ambiguity involves a single situation or idea that is perceived in 2 self-consistent but mutually incompatible frames of reference. Byers discusses how equations like 2 + 3 = 5 contain 2 separate frames of reference. On the left-hand side, 2 + 3 is a process, a verb, the addition of 3 to 2, an arithmetic combining of 2 numbers. On the right-hand side is the number 5. Processes as verbs are different from objects as nouns. This seems to be a category error, worse than combining apples and oranges. Yet the equation, as we all know, is true. What are we to make of this? Does arithmetic reconcile ambiguous category errors? Byers also looks at variables in algebraic equations such as 3x + 2 = 8. Does the x refer to any number a variable, any possibility, or does it refer simply to the number 2? Why 2? Well, when we subtract 2 from both sides, 3x plus 2 minus 2 is 3x. 8 minus 2 is 6. 3x equals 6. We divide 3 on both sides, we get x is 2. That's the solution. But does x refer to any number or 2? Byers explains, quote, "The answer is both and neither. At the beginning, x could be anything. At the end, x can only be the number 2. Variables in mathematical discourse always entail this ambiguous status where they are general and specific depending on our frame of reference. My synergetics colleague, Tom Miller, calls such situations the both neither, where 2 perspectives, hypotheses, or frames of reference are both true and at the same time, each is not true. The both neither is a kind of ambiguity." Byers gives many more examples. He concludes, I quote, "The control in mathematics is provided by the logical structure, and the power and profundity of mathematics is a consequence of having deep ambiguity under the strictest logical control. The ambiguity is resolved by the creation of a larger meaning that contains the original meanings and reduces to them in special cases. This process requires a creative act of understanding or insight." Next, I'm going to look at contradiction. Contradictions are almost the same as ambiguities. The difference is that in contradictions, the 2 mutually incompatible frames of reference cannot be resolved into a single situation or idea that is consistent. The 2 frames of reference conflict so incompatibly that we call them inconsistent. Byers' favorite example of the power of contradictories in mathematics is the number 0. He characterizes 0 using the title from Robert Kaplan's 1999 book, The Nothing That Is. The nothing that is an apt description of 0's inherently contradictory nature. How can we represent nothing? For students of mathematics, the task is simple. Represent it with the word 0 and the symbol 0. We say that 0 is a number, a definite object, but this object represents nothing. How can that be? Can we honestly say that the number 0 is nothing? Byers writes, "Does nothing exist? And if not, how can we talk of it? 0 is a name for something that does not exist." The concept of 0 was a crucial advance in the history of mathematics, yet it seems inherently contradictory. Byers observes, quote, "Far from excising the contradiction from our thought, we have learned to use it in a constructive and creative manner." He adds that from 0, a concept that is inherently contradictory has been made ambiguous by creating out of 0 a single idea. 0 is the single idea of a number that stands for nothingness. We boldly ignore the inherent contradiction at the heart of the idea except, of course, when we divide by 0, which is strictly verboten. Byers adds both coherence and contradiction are fundamental components of ambiguity. The both neither captures this principle by highlighting the coherence, the both, and the contradiction, the neither. Both neither contrasts with both and in our culture's current zeitgeist. Both neither is the logic of ambiguity. If ambiguity is as fundamental as William Byers argues, then both neither logic may be more important than the both and logic that many of us have been using. Okay. I just wanted to take a look and see if anyone was in the waiting room.
Yes, I'm trying to cross check anybody that's in the waiting room with the lists on Meetup.
Are you a co-organizer yet, Joe?
I am. So
okay, great. So I will let you do that. Now to explore paradox. Byers quotes the Encarta World English Dictionary for a definition of paradox. A paradox is a situation or proposition that seems to be absurd or contradictory, but is or may be true. In contradiction, we know that the two frames of reference are inherently inconsistent. In paradox, there is a possibility of reconciliation, of resolving the absurdity. Byers writes, paradox is not something alien to life. It is the basic fabric out of which life is composed. Is 0 merely paradoxical or inherently contradictory? I think it depends on your spiritual beliefs about logic. If your spirituality of logic rejects contradictions, then in order to keep 0, you would consider 0 merely paradoxical. But if your spirituality tolerates truths in contradictions, you might prefer to call a spade and say that 0 is contradictory. Let me quote how Byers addresses this concern. He writes, 0 is paradoxical. It contains a contradictory aspect, and yet it is a fundamental mathematical concept. Does that suggest that if an idea is contradictory, but sufficiently useful, we should set aside its contradictoriness so we can access the idea's creative power? Would that then suggest that our culture's overemphasis on the so-called law of non-contradiction, which prohibits contradictions, is misplaced? Byers' book goes on to explore the paradoxes of infinity in depth. He explains that contradictions and paradoxes are two aspects of ambiguity. So that means in his scheme, ambiguity in all its manifestations is the crucial idea. Byers says, quote, logic moves in the direction of clarity, coherence, and structure. Ambiguity moves in the other direction, that of fluidity, openness, and release. Mathematics moves back and forth between these two poles. Byers' schema for ambiguity in learning accommodates two poles or phases. The contracting, converging phase brings clarity, coherence, and structure by learning in depth. The expanding or diverging phase brings fluidity, openness, and release by learning in breadth. Control and logic work to make the system cohere in a meaningful structure. It focuses, contracts, and converges to produce depth. Learning in breadth with its context confronts us with ambiguities and their incompatible stories or data and frames of reference, challenging our ability to find resonant wholes for meaning making as we diverge and expand our perspective. Okay, that's the end of segment 1. Joe, is Srikant still busy?
I am back.
Okay, Srikant, I suggest we do a 20-minute breakout so that people can explore. Where's my question? What role does ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox play in learning?
Wonderful, folks. So that's the question. The rules in the breakout room: keep on topic, be brief, and be courteous. Feel free to disagree, but do so courteously. The breakout rooms are going to be facilitated by Joe, Becky, and CJ. Starting the breakout rooms now. In 20 minutes, you'll automatically come back here for part 2 of the presentation. Starting the breakout rooms now.
Okay. The second segment, I'm going to explore some ideas from William Byers on ideas, great ideas, and truth. In the second section of William Byers' book, he builds on the above foundation from the first segment on ambiguity to explore the nature and truth of ideas. Byers writes, and I quote, "The creative in mathematics is expressed through the birth of new ideas. These ideas may consist of a new way of thinking about a familiar concept, or they may involve the development of an entirely novel concept." I collected some more quotes that I think summarize Byers' thinking about how ambiguity and ideas are connected. Quote, "An idea emerges in response to the tension that results from the conflict inherent in ambiguity. An idea is a principle that organizes experience. It is an answer to the question, what is going on here? The ambiguity does not limit the idea. The ambiguity is the very thing that flowers into the idea." Byers asserts that great ideas come out of situations of great ambiguity. He then develops the great idea of one. Quoting Byers again, "One is an idea that goes beyond mathematics. As was the case with zero and nothing, the mathematical one is an idea that grows out of the human condition itself." Notice that one and the connected idea of oneness are ambiguous. That is, they are used in two different and conflicting senses. In the first sense, one represents something that is a unit and distinct from all others, a unique individual in a world of other individuals. The second sense comes from the word oneness, to be one with, which means connected or part of a larger whole. The first sense emphasizes the uniqueness and separateness of that which is designated as the one, And the second, the harmonious integration of parts. Byers goes on to give many other examples of ideas in mathematics. He explores how the idea is always wrong. This reminds me of Jan Zwicky's realization that our meaning-making insights may not be true, as we explored in the event on the whole shebang last year. It is the reason we have emphasized mistake mystique in several previous events. And it's also a reminder of the both neither logic, where the coexistence of coherence and contradiction are an inherent aspect of ambiguity. The both neither logic in Byers's description is inherent in ideas also. Byers writes, "We are beginning to see paradox not as something to be avoided and eliminated, but as a potentially rich source of ideas." Byers motivates his exploration of what he calls great ideas with a Simone Weil quote. She writes, quote, "All true good carries with it conditions which are contradictory, and as a consequence, impossible. He who keeps his attention really fixed on this impossibility and acts will do what is good. In the same way, all truth contains a contradiction." Byers adapts her quote to say, "A great idea carries with it conditions which are contradictory and as a consequence impossible." He emphasizes that a great idea begins with a gap that seems unbridgeable. Logic then helps us formulate and organize the idea. Nonetheless, there are always limitations. Some of the falseness remains. Byers clarifies, "It is not the idea so much as the universality of the idea that is false. Great ideas are wrong, but they are wrong in a brilliant and inspired way." I hear Byers characterizing truth as the insight of creative immediate certainty when the light is turned on. This seems to me analogous to the experience of meaning of Jan Zwicky in the formation of Gestalt wholes. Byers says the truth cannot be completely objectified. It is not completely out there. Truth is a kind of objective subjectivity or a subjective objectivity. It cannot be completely formalized or captured. It is like a rainbow. It is objective, but we can never find the end of the rainbow because it is not really an object. The truth is the coherence of a great idea together with its falseness, its contradiction, its ambiguity, its inherent both neither logic. Srikand, let's do another 20-minute breakout to explore the relationship between ambiguity and our ideas, great ideas, and truths.
Wonderful. Thank you, folks. Same rules. Keep on topic, be brief, and be courteous. Again, CJ, Becky, and Joe will be facilitating. In 20 minutes, we'll be back. And when we come back with the best question that we have. That's the plan, right? It's going to be...
Well, we got a third segment.
Okay. And after the third segment, we're going to do questions?
Yes.
Okay. So do think of the best question that you have. Keep it ready for the lightning round of Q&A. All right. Starting the breakout rooms now. Go ahead, CJ.
Write it down.
Yes, exactly. Starting the breakout rooms now. Folks, welcome back. All right, CJ, the floor is yours.
Okay, in my breakout, we weren't able to get to everyone through the second time round, but we'll be taking questions soon. So if you have a question that you didn't get to ask, write it down so that in a few minutes we'll be doing a Q&A. I wanted to reflect a little bit on William Byers' thinking about ambiguity, ideas, truths, as I present in the first two segments, and comprehensive learning. What will we get if we incorporate William Byers' thinking about the central role of ambiguity in ideas, truths, and learning in our developing story about comprehensive learning? Comprehensive learning involves studying more and more sources from more and more of humanity's great traditions of inquiry and action. These explorations inevitably lead to expanding the number of potentially incompatible hypotheses, perspectives, and frames of reference that we consider. As a result, we are sure to confront ambiguities. Byers' approach sees these ambiguities as tools to help us organize our learning. With Byers' insights, we can appreciate the ambiguity between breadth and depth as the two poles of comprehensive learning. Breadth is the diverging, expanding, and contextualizing phase. Depth is the converging, contracting, and clarifying phase. With this perspective, perhaps, we can better judge how to keep breadth and depth in balance in our learning. Inspired by how mathematics has profitably organized numbers such as 1 and 0, arithmetic operations, and algebra's powerful ideas, we also may apply various logics to see if we can ferret out ideas that integrate the different frames of reference and perspectives that we are studying. Even if we succeed, we know from the examples of mathematics that inevitably some ambiguity will remain to spur us on to further learning. Byers' discussion on seeing the light in the context of ambiguity may help us better understand the adequate wholeness we value for meaning making. We may come to realize that our experiences of meaning, as Jan Zwicky calls them, inherently involve ambiguity, paradox, and even contradiction. Byers' insights reinforce our value of mistake mystique, where we valorize looking for and identifying the gaps in our understandings, communications, and designs. Indeed, inherent ambiguity explains why there must be such gaps. It also explains why the logic of the both neither can help us better find the ambiguities in our ideas, principles, and truths to spur us to deeper thinking. Ambiguity, with its both neither logic, can also help us organize comprehensive comprehensions, our most integrated forms of knowing. Ambiguities naturally suggest questions that characterize what we do not understand, our ignorance. Our value for a thoroughly refined ignorance aspires us toward a question-structured survey of our learning. This refined ignorance can now be seen as an outline of the ambiguities we have identified. If this way of integrating our knowledge facilitates effective judgment making, we will have understood the incisive aspects of our situation. William Byers shows that embracing ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox can reward us with access to the creative wellspring of great ideas and truths. As we try to integrate more and more of humanity's traditions of inquiry and action, we should consider engaging the ambiguities we may have shied away from previously. Okay, Srikand, let's take questions.
All right, so we will do it the same way, right?
You're muted.
CJ? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll do it the same way. So we'll take all the questions, and then we'll put it on the table. And CJ, would you like to go last in answering the questions? Or you can type in whenever you want. Otherwise, you're last.
I prefer to go last unless it's maybe something I should jump in on. So
Sounds good. All right, folks, it's time for questions, which is the most important part of this entire meetup. The whole purpose that CJ puts all of this work so that we can generate questions from you guys. And we can have a discussion. So go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to put a question on the table. We're going to start with Kevin, Chang, and Vanessa. So the way we do this is that I'm going to collect all the questions, organize all the questions, and then take them one by one, and everybody gets to answer the questions. Kevin, go ahead. What's your question?
Thank you, Srikand and CJ. My question is, basic text ambiguity have two options. Is both or neither logic. Is possible has another two, either or random. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Can ambiguity be either or? Next up.
Either or and random.
And random, okay. Either or slash random. Okay. Next up is going to be Zheng, Vanessa, and Allison. Zheng, what's your question?
Yeah, my question is, as we learned from Dao De Jing, the word is ambiguous and random. So my question is the random and ambiguity is because of in the mass, is that part of the reason of the reality of truth is ambiguous and paradox? That's why the mass is one way of approach the reality. That's why it has to be like that. Or it's just the limitation of the tool itself.
Okay, wonderful. Is randomness and ambiguity part of reality or part of the tool of mathematics? Next up is Vanessa. Vanessa, what's your question?
Is it okay to have a problem that there is a fixed solution? Such as, let's say you've got some marbles you're filling in an enclosed area. What's the maximum you can give up there if you have enough restraints and limitations? And then if, okay, you think that's not okay, leave it. Okay, if you have kind of, okay, can we somehow change and get more in there and leave it up to the thing, but you still have that one set answer. You can't get any more in that without splitting them up.
Thank you.
Does that have a place?
Is it okay to have a fixed solution without ambiguity? Next up is Allison.
What role does ambiguity play when mathematicians are figuring out things like the black hole, things that can't possibly be measured, touched?
Okay. What role ambiguity plays in things like a black hole, which are very difficult to figure out. Okay, next up is going to be Joe, followed by Mike S. Joe.
I still haven't really thought this through, but how does randomness relate to how we can improve ourselves, or how we view ourselves in a way? If we start to understand that everything is random, then how does that dictate our actions?
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out.
Okay. How does the phenomena of randomness itself, what kind of strategies of self-improvement you can get from there? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, or how does it impact how we act or behave in the world, or think about the world? Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Strategy of thinking or doing. Okay, very good. Next up is going to be Mike S. Mike S., what's your question?
Is our problem with paradoxes is that we think truth is a scalar. In particular, we're saying that there's two kinds of paradoxes. One of them are semantic and the other are logical. But if we think of truth as really a vector or really a manifold, we can solve problems that he talks about of different orders of infinity. We can also solve problems of, or I should say, can we solve problems of Schrodinger's cat being both alive or dead? Can we solve problems by thinking of truth as a manifold of a quantum qubit can either be 1 or 0, or 1 and 0 simultaneously? Can we solve problems at a 36-bit word of qubits, where each bit has a value of either 1 or 0, defines a manifold that allows us to factor large prime numbers or how proteins are folded to come up with a new protein to solve a vaccine problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. So is our paradoxes based on thinking of things in scalar, and can that be solved by dealing with vectors or manifolds? Next up is going to be Joe.
Yeah, I was thinking also, how does contradiction and ambiguity actually improve the breadth of understanding of a problem?
Wonderful. Okay, very good. CJ.
Srikant, we should include George's question about refined ignorance. Could refined ignorance lead back to blank slate by weeding out unnecessary assumptions?
Wonderful. Refined ignorance. Okay. Let's see here. Wow. Let's see where. How about we start with Jean's question, because it is fundamental. Is the phenomena of randomness and ambiguity part of nature, part of reality? Or wait a minute, David, you have a question? Oh no. Okay. All right. Okay, folks. Now it's time for answers. David has an answer before I can state the question, which is great. So the question is the phenomena of randomness or ambiguity part of nature, part of reality, or is it a result of the tool of mathematics or thinking? Is it epistemological or is it metaphysical? So go ahead, Jeff, followed by David. Jeff, you had a question? Okay, let me put Jeff's question. Go ahead, or do you have an answer?
Well, actually, my question is related to this question. So, my question is, would fully embracing ambiguity, contradictions, and paradox require us to decide or accept that all our conclusions must forever be temporary?
Wonderful. So
I think that is actually kind of like a full circle question with this opening question.
Thank you.
I'll let you decide.
Thank you. So we'll take that later. So first question is about ambiguity and randomness. Is it in reality or is it in our mind? David S.
Right. I think it's a great and really interesting question. I would start off in this direction on it, that question. So you're thinking about how to see reality in terms of its randomness, its ambiguity. Our own thinking may be a sort of reduction of things in the first place. So you're asking the question, we're thinking and we're reducing things to non-contradictory logical categories that can't possibly entail what look like opposites. So your question is saying, well, how can, because reality, like, I think when I think this or when I think this. And there's reality doing both. But maybe we'll end up resolving it with our ways of thinking, because our categorizing things doesn't mean the world is that way. It means that's the way we're looking at the world, right? So we have to be open. So we have to embrace, which I think is what the last person to just adding on, there's an advantage in understanding that our own thinking is a kind of reducing, by and large, in order to talk and discuss and have concepts and act, we go to clarity, black and white, 0, 1, as Mike was saying, one dimensionality. We project to get an understanding. That's understanding, but our understanding is capable of moving and having a different understanding because we have perspective. So I think our embracing it allows reality to be, don't give me the word for it, that's reality. To clamp on one word is to do an act of understanding of a particular kind.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Vanessa, followed by Neil. Vanessa, what do you think? Is this in reality or is it in the mind?
I guess I would say in reality. You mentioned nature. And even if you try to have the same day, you try to have all the things controlled, there's going to be something you can't control. And there's so many variable combinations. You're never having the same thing twice. And there's going to be something that's slightly different. And because you observe that in life, maybe it was easier to develop math. So maybe you can understand and realize some people may have two different ways they define zero in the concept. So you observe in nature and say, okay, well, this is how nature is. Let's maybe describe it with mathematical concept definitions, numbers, etc.
Thank you. Next up is Neil.
I would have to say that in pure math, there probably is no ambiguity. Mathematics just is. It itself is its own consistency. We can never understand it. But mathematics then has no ambiguity, no paradox, no contradictions. Our understanding of mathematics, though, is filled with it. And we understand a lot of things without contradiction and paradox, and there are many things which we just get down to and it's contradictory. And there's a third realm, which is the physical realm, physics. Physics has ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox because we don't understand it, and it's not clear we ever will understand quantum physics, relativity, black holes, the things that go on there. We are trying, but I don't think we'll ever be able to get complete understanding of that. So there's ambiguity in the physical world, there's ambiguity in our conceptual world, but I don't think mathematics has any ambiguity or paradoxes.
Thank you, Neil. CJ, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll rip off Neil. The assumption that mathematics has no ambiguities is an assumption that there is a single kind. All mathematics is based on assumptions. I learned this. You can only begin a mathematical discussion with some assumptions. And usually those assumptions include rules of inference, sometimes called axioms. And, mathematics tries to, if they play by the rules, to be perfectly work out the same all the time. But the history of mathematics shows that very often we discover that we were sometimes applying additional logics that weren't explicitly stated. And that in fact there are two geometries, non-Euclidean and Euclidean, and we didn't realize that. So we don't have one mathematics, we have two mathematics, or a bifurcation of mathematics. So I think it would be astounding that there was only one mathematics that was perfectly clear. More likely there are infinity of mathematics, all of which are competing. Randomness was Zhang's question, and reality. And it's not just randomness in reality. What about theology in reality? Is reality necessarily suffused with a godlike concept or spirits or magical principles of the occult, or is it randomness, or is it certainty? Is reality a set of differential equations that we might discover in science, like Newton's laws, and I don't know how we get to the only, you can assume and explore those assumptions, but there's no way to be sure, even if you've got all the experimental evidence, even if you've got all the logics applied, you can never be fully sure that you've actually figured out the way God engineered the universe. There's always the possibility that you've got your categories wrong, that you've got your assumptions wrong. So I think reality itself is largely unknowable. And the best we can do is try designs. Some of you have studied The Design Way, an excellent book about design. And I think the best we can do is design as best we can using our best models and best logics. And when it doesn't work out, revisit and try to figure out what ambiguity messed us up.
Wonderful. Thank you. The next question is going to be, let me see. I can take Joe's question. Given the phenomena of randomness, what kind of strategies of thinking and operation do we need to use? If you'd like to answer the question, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. We'll start with Zhang.
Yeah, I'm not sure this related to this math thinking, but I think we learned so many different, like Dao De Jing, Gita, and John. Actually, I talked with a musician friend today who's also a painter, and we were talking about, and it's tied back to Stoicism, how people need to find true self and centered. Then all this random doesn't matter anymore. Like nature, like you're a boat floating. No matter where you go, if you're centered, it doesn't matter wherever you are. The randomness, the ambiguity, not even relevant. It's just part of the experience. I'm not sure it's really related to this talk. But anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you, Zhang. Next up is David and Becky. David.
Oh, so CJ typed in the specific question that Joe asked. Is that right?
No.
Oh, okay, because you typed in why is randomness necessarily the right model for understanding and acting. Yeah, regarding what I thought Srikand had asked for Joe about using randomness as part of our model, that I don't think randomness stands in our way in certain things. We recognize randomness. We can't avoid randomness, but there is a level of randomness, and it's not thoroughgoing chaos. So even though we just talked about the ambiguity and randomness of life and reality and how it strikes us that way, there's also the flip side of order. The world is incredibly predictable and ordered in a large number of ways, and we thrive on that. And we also mostly make our meaning in that way. So our meaning, our meaningful structure of what matters and is important is something that is so given and so not random that really what we can do can really matter, even though the results may not turn out as we want. What we have done really matters. And the way we look at what we've done and learn from, I could have done better, is not saying there's a randomness to it. It's saying what I knew, what I used, what I did, what I understood had an orderliness to it. And I'm striving for that beauty. And the storm I'm running into with all the wind blowing at me does not deter me from running forward. You know what I mean?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, David. Great point. Next up is Becky, followed by Vanessa. Becky.
Yeah, I really loved David's point. If you look on the spectrum of like absolute randomness, absolute chaos, versus no randomness, they both produce the same thing in your life, that you have no control. And so nothing matters. So like the strategy would be pretty much nihilism for life. But it, as David had mentioned, that's not the case. And so I like to think of it as, okay, you have a mean and your trajectory is like this until you decide to do things. And so you can deviate that up, down, but then of course there's going to be some randomness around it, but it's not complete chaos and it's not predictable. You still have your actions, and we act like that's the case. Your actions will dictate how much you go. And maybe those little random pieces, like good luck, well, that might propel you a little bit higher. And then you continue your trajectory just higher. Or, bad fortune, you're still down here, but how you move, how you direct your life still has a point. And on top of that, you're not doing it individually neither. Other people around you also dictate what happens. And it's the same thing. You can somewhat predict what they're going to do, but not fully. And they themselves have lots of randomness around them too. So that's how I like to think of it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Vanessa, followed by Neil. Vanessa.
Actually, I have a real-time example of Joe's question. I actually had my hand up earlier related to what CJ was talking about, theology and reality. And I think my mind just traveled down the road about, what about animal behavior? Now, they may not have a God, but some species have behavior unique to them involving death. Like maybe they avoid an area, or maybe they go to a set place to die. So there's some behavior that may be to a certain species that still involves death. And, whether the afterlife, they'll avoid this area, whether they have a memory. So it's not just unique to humans, but that's like the way my mind went. It decided to take that path, and tomorrow it'll decide to get a coffee.
Thank you. Next up is Neil.
I want to dovetail off of what Becky and David were saying. I think one way to, if you will, to live your life is to recognize that there are things you can't control. There's randomness you can't control. There's ambiguity and paradox you can't control. But if you put it in a box and understand the possible outcomes of the randomness and ambiguity and stuff, then you can deal with it and work with it and put structure in the rest of your life that doesn't have the randomness and leave that ambiguity there. I think back, if anybody watched the Matrix series, all three movies, not the fourth one, one of the major points towards the end of the third movie was that, or the second movie, the architect gathered all the randomness into one individual because otherwise he couldn't have a perfect system. And life is like that. The world is like that. Sometimes you have to have some ambiguity and randomness and paradox to make everything consistent. You just can try and keep it in a small area, controllable and understandable, and then the rest of it can work nicely and cleanly, leaving all the randomness in one spot.
Thank you, Neil. Next up is Joe, followed by CJ. Sure.
So I'm going to just have a very, very brief answer is that building and David, Becky, and Neil actually really captured what I was trying to ask, the question itself. But understanding that the world is random is extremely liberating in its own right, because once you understand that, then you can bring a certain degree of order to your life, and you can start to see yourself how you fit into this random world, and that the actions that happen in this world aren't necessarily about you per se. So then it allows you to act independently more with a certain amount of freedom. So anyway, I thought that David and Becky and Neil really thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Allison.
I think we all need a certain amount of order in the world. And so sometimes chaos can seem frightening, but I think that actually we need to not assume that because something is random or unexpected that it's bad, because sometimes the best things come along that are really wonderful. So we need to, allow serendipity and welcome it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Allison. Let's see here. Next up is Becky.
CJ mentioned something very interesting. You can characterize the randomness with certain probability distributions based off of the type of situation you're engaging in too. So even there, it's like there's some way to estimate that randomness. You want to avoid situations where there's like a fat tail of complete ruin, right? And like risk is just like not worth it. But so even there's not like randomness isn't completely random. You can still guess somewhat.
Wonderful. Next up is CJ.
Yeah, I think Joe's question was getting to design again and action. And, I guess, randomness is one of the stances an individual can take as part of their mindset in your design and action. But it's not necessarily the one you would want to use, and it's not necessarily the one you have to use. As Becky picked up on, I actually wrote an essay on how randomness implies order, because there's a mathematical theory, Kolmogorov's theory of randomness and all that. And then if you take a purely deterministic system, the initial conditions may be unknowable, at which point your purely deterministic system behaves randomly. So it's like whatever starting point you start at, you then find patterns, and then you discover that it's a little bit of a both neither situation.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up, let's take a very tough question that Mike asks. The paradoxes, is it the result of the mathematics that we are using just scalars? And can that be dealt with by using manifolds or vectors or some other mathematics? So is the paradox, the generation of paradox, a result of the mathematics that we are using? We'll start with David. David, go ahead.
Right. So I think one thing I would assume is we're often talking about things being more complex than we can comprehend. So once we're willing to say we're finite and we only have so many categories we can form, and by the way, we've only been here for a finite number of seconds in the universe, and there's only a finite amount of matter, and there's only, but the number of combinations is not like that. It just has no limit to how many different ways things can be arranged and ordered and partially and even more. So our comprehending of things is to jam them into pigeonholes. And that's what we do to understand. That's what we call understanding. Category clear, black and white, and how gray. And when it doesn't, we call it chaotic and random. And a mathematician will come up with a definition for random, meaning I don't have something to pin it down in the categories. So I forgot the question, but that's where it took me. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, no, the final answer real quick. So, Mike, if it only takes a countable number of categories to fully understand stuff, we're out of luck anyway. We can't do it. So just the fact that it's slightly out of reach, it might as well be all the way out of reach. So we have to deal with the randomness because that's who we are.
David, you somehow managed to remain on point even when you forget the question. That's amazing. Thank you. Next up is going to be Becky.
I agree. I think that it's more complex than just moving up several dimensions. And so, I think that that is one way of resolving a paradox, but not all of them, or not a paradox. Many paradoxes, but not all of them, because it's like, well, you're still to go from a scalar to several dimensions. It's like, okay, well, you're still in the same framework, but sometimes that ambiguity or that paradox or that supposed contradiction seems to be there. For example, I'm going to give an example of 0 is actually 1. Like, okay, well, but if you look at it, perhaps that really is the case in different complete frameworks. So an example is, well, let's look at the identity. In addition, 0 is the identity. And then, but in multiplication, 1 is the identity. So here, there's that equivalence of 0 is 1, just in different frameworks. And that you don't get from just moving up the dimensions. Whereas an example of resolving a paradox that Mike had mentioned would be on a one dimension, the measure of 0 to 2 would be the length would be 2. But once you move to a different dimension, well, it's going to look differently, right? And so the measure of that would be 0, because that's a one-dimensional line. That line has a 0 measure. So there are paradoxes that exist within the framework that might be resolved, and sometimes they're outside. But even so, there are a lot of paradoxes that just can't be resolved. So you could throw in more axioms and still, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. If you keep throwing in axioms and you're like, you can't just solve it with one thing, or ever. Some of them.
Thank you, Becky. Next up is CJ.
Yeah, I'll emphasize in all mathematical discussions, you have to begin with some assumptions. What are the rules of logic we're going to admit? What kind of number system are we using? Maybe it's a vector-based system. Maybe it's a matrix or a tensor-based system. And those assumptions are inherently ambiguous because we could choose to exclude that assumption. We could choose its negative. We could choose a third assumption that's neither the assumption nor its opposite. We could go into moduli spaces instead of vector spaces. There are so many ambiguities at the assumptions level before you even get started, that taking any given mathematical model, Srikand, you organized an excellent meetup on mathematics with a mathematical modeler. And he emphasized that every mathematical model begins with assumptions. The ambiguity starts with those assumptions. Then you do your mathematics and you find out the consequences of your approach to the mathematical model. You compare it to reality and you say, you know, maybe we should look back at those assumptions and change them. The ambiguity is right in the assumptions.
So I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to put a question late on the table here, because I found this to be the most fascinating part of this entire essay. That is the connection between depth and breadth, because it goes to the heart of, you know, what we're trying to do, you know, macro comprehensive and micro incisive. So, you know, how do you maximize, how do you optimize between breadth and depth? And how does the tool do that? So I'm going to read out from the essay. The contracting or converging phase brings clarity, coherence, and structure by learning in depth. The expanding or diverging phase brings fluidity, openness, and release by learning in breadth. So keep mathematics aside for a moment, but you can use it if you want. How do we use tools? How do we use strategies which optimize? We need, you know, as comprehensivists, we need breadth and we need depth. How do we choose one and or the other in situations? How do we choose the combinations? How do we play between depth and breadth? What is the method for doing that? How do you do that? So that's the question I want to put on the table. If you'd like to answer, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. We'll start with Becky.
What I do is that once I have a certain amount of information or knowledge, I'll go deep into it, like through logical deductions and everything, until I reach something that is outside of what that knowledge has allowed me to gain further understanding. And or if I hit a contradiction or something, and that's when I go outside and I reach in for more, because I understand that, okay, well, there's only a limit to what I have right here, and by opening that scope, I can reassess what I've deduced as right or true, and perhaps learn even more. And so once I put something in and I'm spreading out, I reassess and I go down deep again, because things might change. What might be a reductionism understanding might be wrong with this new thing that I'm adding in, but I'm also careful about what I filter in. And so that's my strategy for learning.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Vanessa, how do you balance depth and breadth? What strategy do you use?
One thing, if we go from the concrete like a rectangle to the more abstract like music, if you go more into the depth, that's maybe more for the perfection understanding, like a virtuoso, versus maybe increasing your collection, maybe more appreciation and maybe more flexibility. So even in applying it depends on, you know, what your goal is. And if you have a wider catalog, or even listen to something maybe you would never listen to, and like, oh my gosh, how that changed my mood and just the effect it has.
Thank you, Vanessa. Mike, what's your answer? How do you handle breadth? I know you have amazing breadth and amazing depth. How do you do it? And how do you know when you are going broad that it's time to go deep, and when you are going in deep, when is it a time to go broad?
Well, taking what CJ started with, we work with a model all the time, and mapping that into what Plato said, that we all live in his cave, and our sense of reality is not what we think it is. And we can't handle the truth, like the guy who escaped from the cave and had to come back because he couldn't. And when he came back and told the people what he learned, they tried to kill him. The short answer is the map is not the territory, and the model is not reality. So it's an iterative situation, and that's what's going on with the 36-bit word of ones and zeros, of every qubit being both a one and a zero.
Thank you.
So you want to hear some more? Can I give you some more?
This is good. Let's let other people.
That's enough. Okay. The map is not the territory.
That's
And even if the reality isn't there. So you got to iteratively go between there with just enough accuracy to solve the problem at hand. And sometimes you can solve the problem at hand. And that's what Baranowski did with his friend Johnny von Neumann. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Jeng, Bob, and Allison. Jeng, how do you do it?
Yeah, actually, I want to share about ambiguity a little bit. So I just realized when we first study something, we tend to be very black and white, you know. But as we look deeper or have deeper understanding, like that's why young people tend to be more extreme. They understand black and white, and the culture too, like culture with long history, like Indian and Chinese, they're more ambiguous. And Western culture tend to be more extreme. That I just realized as you get much more mature and deeper, then you tend to be more ambiguous. Yeah, about learning, I found to go, because our time is so limited, you know, we really want to learn so many things. So we can only focus on one thing to get deeper, but with all the interest we have, we can get wider with all the other things we're interested. And the one thing we learn deeper, actually use that skill, is easily to get something else deeper with the time goes on. You have some extra time, you can, you know, quicker to learn the other subject quicker. So that's my experience.
Thank you. Thank you, Jean. Bob, what is your strategy for using depth and breadth?
I actually had to deal with this a lot when I was a teacher. I taught physics for many years, and I made a conscious choice after maybe the first 2 years of teaching that I was going to concentrate on depth as opposed to breadth. And there's trade-offs. I think teaching about the nature of the physical world, you need to have some depth in order to really develop a level of comprehension about how the game works. But then there would be a student who would say to me, I'm going to be taking the physics achievement test. Well, for that person, depth isn't necessarily helpful. Though I used to say I'm not teaching to that person within the confines of my class, because there it was a thick textbook worth of topics. You don't really have to know much about anything, but you had to know a lot of subjects. In principle, you did. And so I still felt that if you wanted to do that, then I'll help you on the side, but it's not the way I'm going to run my class. And over the years, I felt comfortable with that.
Thank you. Next up is Allison, Enro, and David. Allison.
Sometimes when I'm studying something, I get really obsessed with it. And then I just want to study every single solitary thing about it. But then I reach a point where I realize that I can't truly know that subject unless I can understand it in relation to other things. So I have to study other things around it and how they relate to that subject to really understand that subject even better.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Enro, followed by David. Enro.
I wanted to adjust myself to a couple of questions that have been raised.
Sure.
One was, and this occurred more actually in the initial part of this discussion before we broke up into groups, I think, but the matter also became relevant within the group discussion. The notion of infinity,
And
again, from the same.
Come back
yes?
to, let's do one thing, Andrew. Let's finish all our questions. Then I'll come to you and you can bring them up. Do you have anything to say about depth and breadth?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That we only have a finite capacity. Our brains only admit to being able to store a finite amount of information as measured by, say, bits of information. So that, and the universe itself, even whether it's finite, whether a knowledge of everything that's in the universe would require an infinite amount of bits of information to describe or to characterize, or whether it would be a finite number, a finite such number would be vastly more than any of our brains would be able to contain. So we can go for either breadth or depth, but we will never get breadth to the extent, because the universe is so extensive, we'll never be able to get the breadth of the entire universe. People have been saying in this discussion that we can only deal with models, and it's not reality. And that is precisely the case. As far as mathematical construction about it, yes, the mathematics involves assumptions, and it's only when we get the ambiguity, and we can explore and get depth by looking at the assumptions, or we can go for the consequences of these assumptions. It's about, we can only go partially either way, either breadth or depth, but not the entirety is potentially out there.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Next up is David.
Okay. So about breadth and depth, I'm going to agree a lot with what was said. I believe, I don't know if this, my belief is that it's like geography. You can look at the map of the whole world, but to really start to make sense and to be able to explore and use maps, you have to become very good at understanding what it is to be looking at a small area of the map, to make sense of it, to learn something well. You have to know something well, I think, and appreciate what it meant to learn, to know, to master one thing. To know also that you have bounds even on that. Then you can go broad. Then you can go for large learning. And like Allison said, integrate what I learned on this with what I learned on that, and its boundaries and connections. So, and see its harmonies and resonances with other things, because you learn something really well, you have a repertoire. So I'd say, was it Zhang who was saying, hit hard in one area, and apply that universally, intensively, and look for the cracks and the gaps and the questions and uncertainties, which was what we're talking about, ambiguities maybe, and then begin to merge other points of view and other ways of seeing, because you learn how to do that by working very hard on individual things that you can knit together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, Srikand, and CJ. Joe.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief on this, but it kind of builds a little bit on what everybody else has said, and specifically even what David has said, is this idea of you go really deep into one particular problem in one particular area, but then you can start to extract certain types of principles from what you actually learned at a higher level. And then you can start to see how they apply in other areas, that it essentially gives you you can start to draw analogies. And now, even though analogies don't necessarily stand up to some of the rigor that we would like sometimes, but I think that you can iterate and kind of come up with your own generalized principles and trying to gain breadth. But when you start by going deep on something, and then you can kind of start to extract generalized principles from there.
Thank you. I want to talk about one of the projects that we have done here on 52 Living Ideas and I want to look at it in terms of breadth and depth. See, I'm not a religious person, and I wanted to learn about the religious traditions. I'm a modern person, and I wanted to look at the scribal tradition of, before print. So we chose 3 works, one from China, one from India, one from the West. Again, kind of choice of these very different cultures was critical, I think. And then we are going into them deep. We are actually, Dao De Jing, Jason and Amon are actually doing the translations. In Gospel of John, we are taking Aquinas' commentary, which is like 30 times larger than the text we are studying. In Gita, we have a person who has studied all the Sanskrit commentaries, and I'm reading Naneshwar's commentary, which is very deep, so it's like very deep dives. And interesting thing is that as we are making these deep dives in parallel, together, like every day it is different, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, we are able to slowly start seeing connections between them, and the depth that is emerging is deeper, actually, and the breadth that is appearing is deeper as a result of choosing this. So that's the strategy that we have used that seems to have worked. At least for me, it is working amazingly well, because I'm getting depth as well as breadth at the same time. So that is my example of kind of using depth and breadth together and in a very deliberate manner. CJ, you by yourself, your study of the breadth that you study and the depth in which you study it is astounding. So how do you manage it? How do you make the choices between breadth and depth? When do you go deep? When do you go breadth? When do you say it is too broad? When do you say it is too depth? How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's really an individual decision, a choice. I don't think there are any rules. As I tried to explain, I see the depth as the converging phase and the breadth as a diverging phase. The depth brings clarity, and the breadth brings context. And different people have different amounts of affinity for depth in certain subjects or other subjects. Maybe you can go deep into mathematics, but you don't like going deep into poetry, or vice versa. Some people, like me, try to challenge ourselves to go into the areas we've been weak and go in depth there, and then keep going broader and broader for context. But when you go too broad for context, you suddenly feel like there's nothing to hold on to. And so maybe it's time to go deep. And I some people will get all excited about something. Maybe they want to solve the world's energy crisis with geothermal, and so they get deep into energy physics. Whatever it is you get excited by that you want your life mission to be, you're going to converge and go in depth. But when you're not sure, or they terminate your position, or you Your company goes bankrupt, or the economy blows up and everyone's out of a job. Now you have to go for breath. You need to find, where else am I going to go? So life situation, personal character, but what you choose, where you choose to go in depth, where you choose to be broad, what you choose to be brought into. These are the choices that make your character and make your style, and that give you a unique way of addressing design problems, a unique way of approaching the world. And so it makes all the difference, but I don't think there's a right way. I would resist that there's a right way. In our culture, so much is depth oriented, with specific careers, with various training certificates and job descriptions with long sets of requirements, that a lot of people feel compelled to take a pre-digested form of depth and master that, so that they can get plugged into one of these job descriptions. But there's no telling what the next economic crisis is going to do to that particular skill set. It might get totally reformed in the next recession, and you might have to reinvent yourself several times. And there's no telling what we should be doing if we were to ignore the HR department and choose our lives on our interests or our assumptions of what the world needs. What does civilization need me to be? That might give a different answer than what does the HR department at the company I'd like to work for.
Wonderful. I think we are running a little bit late. Do you want to do your closing, or is there a question that you absolutely must answer?
Are there any other questions that relate to comprehensivism? George's question relates to comprehensivity. Can you find any other questions that relate to comprehensivity? I love your last one on depth and breadth. Are there any others besides George?
No, I would say that's the only one, the refined ignorance. So if you want, you can go ahead and answer that and then proceed to the closing statement.
Where was it?
The question was about refined ignorance.
Right.
But wait, let me see.
Let me find it.
Let's see here, where is it? Further back. Okay,
there it is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could refined ignorance lead back to blank slate, progressively reading out unnecessary assumptions, innocent child mind as blank slate? Refined ignorance is this concept I developed first in the Tricia Wong video. There's a Tricia Wong video that I like, that I wrote an essay on. And in that essay, she was exploring multiple perspectives, and and she was critiquing truth. She actually had this outlandish comment that don't trust the truth. And so I explored that. And in the exploration there, I came up with this idea that as we ask questions, we reveal the different perspectives. Different questions may lead us to one perspective or the other, or to highlight in tonight's presentation, I highlighted the questions may identify and clarify the ambiguities, the contradictions, the paradoxes involved in one or more perspectives about. And so a refined ignorance is this idea that we can use questions to reveal. And does that get to blank mind, child mind? Yeah, I think it's related to child's mind, which you could call a blank mind. I think that's a useful model and perspective. And but I think it is deeply tied to ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox.
Wonderful. So, CJ, your closing statement, please.
Yeah. Ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox are tools to help the comprehensive explorer sensitively tune in to one of the biggest challenges in comprehensive practice. The fact that some traditions have seemingly contradictory, or at least ambiguous ideas or perspectives in comparison to other traditions. And as comprehensive practitioners, we want to explore them all. That brings us to these ambiguities. The ambiguity, contradiction, and paradox in William Byers's thinking, where he relates it into ideas and truths, can therefore be helpful for our comprehensive exploration. But not everyone is going to use every tool that may be in our comprehensivist toolbox. Some tradition we might really value might really clash with another tradition. We might feel we need to reject it. For example, the logical positivist tradition embraces what I call a spirituality of logic that admits no contradictions and has this ebullient confidence that there are no unexplainable paradoxes or ambiguities, and we can still get to good knowledge. This kind of spirituality aspires to a crisp truth, which can be alluring. And for all we know, it might be that the universe was actually designed in such a crisp, unambiguous way. But alas, none of us are God herself. We cannot be sure that that unambiguous universal perspective, that crisp definition of truth, is real. And we can't even be sure what its nature is. So it seems to me that insisting on one tradition, any tradition, as correct is a bit presumptuous. We just can't know for sure. So the comprehensive explorer, it short circuits our exploration. We would like to know all the possible alternatives and not just reach for one presumed clarity, one presumed approach. So for the comprehensive practitioner, each tradition should be studied, even ones that contradict our instincts. But some of us are not going to be able to go into these unappealing traditions that maybe contradict our spiritual beliefs. We all have deep intuitions about the nature of the world. Is it fundamentally random? Is it fundamentally ordered? Is it a complex blending of order and randomness? Is there a principle of magic or spirit beings or gods that intertwine with the fabric of the universe in some way we don't know. We can't know these things. But some of us have deep intuitions. We know that Jesus is the true savior, or that Muhammad is the true savior. Some of us think that it's randomness and it's purely materialistic. These are all what I call spiritualities of logic or ontology that a broad explorer should respect. It could be. We can't disprove any of them. But some of these explorers may not want to embrace other traditions. They may be so committed to their spiritual approach. And I think that's okay. So long as we're all open to broadly exploring traditions that may not, in some broad enough category, but maybe excluding those that totally contradict my spirituality, we can admit them into the big tent of comprehensive practitioners. For all we know, in 1,000 or maybe 10,000 or maybe 1,000,000 years, we might learn enough to know that one tradition, or maybe it'll be the contradictory opposite, will be recognized as the correct approach. I don't know. Until then, our comprehensive outlook suggests we need explorers examining each of these spiritual possibilities, the ones that might animate the world this way or that way, that might animate the world with this logic or that logic. And if these ideas contradict our own, William Byers has given us some confidence to search through those ambiguities, to find new creative truths, new creative ideas that might be the basis for the next idea that will advance civilization. With respect to the prefix for my title tonight, Tools for Our Comprehensivity, I've identified 7 more tools, and maybe roughly half my events this year will explore various tools for comprehensivity. Next month, my draft title is Articulating Comprehensivity, Initiative Taking, Intention, Mission, and Vision, where I expect to reflect on getting into action with comprehensive practice. I plan to write an essay, but it may not be available until March 10th. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, CJ. All right, folks. The last thing is I want to tell you big things that are happening with the meetups. It's just lots and lots of changes. We've not made so many changes in the meetups in a long, long time. Change number 1, Thursdays, we are moving the Gospel of John to conversations on Gospel of John's and moving it to the weekends. So from next Thursday onwards, we are starting a series called Bring Your Self-Improvement Ideas. So people can talk about what ideas they have found useful in changing their lives. It will be a crowdsourced meetup. That's going to be on Thursday. We are doubling up on Bhagavad Gita. We are doing Bhagavad Gita on Fridays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time and Saturdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. On Mondays, we are launching a series on poetry. We've not done poetry at all in this meetup. We've done once because Joe brought If. But we're going to do that every Monday because poetry is a great way of expanding our consciousness by bringing in consciousnesses of so many people, because the poems are very short and they really characterize the mind who produced it. So Maritza is going to be leading that series. he knows a lot more about poetry than I do. So it's going to be wonderful. We're starting with Emily Dickinson. Next Wednesday, of course, Sanjay is going to be back on neuroscience. We're launching a series by Mark Stallman on February 27th. We are doing monthly conversations with Yasuhiko Kimura. And the conversation next time, it's incredible. I don't know how, but he's managed to pick up on 3 big things that we've been studying. This is going to be on March 6th, Saturday. I've not announced it yet. It's going to be on polymathic autodidactic spirituality. So 3 of the things that we've been looking at, all rolled into one. So that's what is coming up, folks. So hope to see you there. And thank you very much, CJ, again. And thank you very much, everybody. Good night.